do we mean when we talk about gentrification, and why is it an issue in the context of a global housing crisis? Well, let's begin by looking at the word itself. The root of the word gentrification is gentry, defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as people of gentle birth or breeding, or in modern English usage, the social class immediately below the nobility. So why does this definition help us? Because it puts the focus on a particular group of people within society, the middle class or upper middle class. So what is it that these groups are doing? Simply put, gentrification happens when these social groups replace lower income groups in particular locations within the city. Generally, this process has been associated with former working class neighbourhoods or industrial districts of inner cities, and takes place through a turnover in the housing market. British sociologist Ruth Glass first introduced the term in 1964 to describe the changes taking place in the social structure and housing market of certain inner London neighbourhoods. She describes the process as follows. One by one, many of the working class quarters have been invaded by the middle class, upper and lower. Once this process of gentrification starts in a district, it goes on rapidly until all or most of the working class occupiers are displaced and the whole social character of the district is changed. More recently, scholars in the UK have defined gentrification as the transformation of a working class or vacant area of the central city into middle class residential or commercial use. To understand how this happens, let's look first at the pull factors attracting these new groups of residents to the areas. In the 1980s, authors such as Neil Smith identified one of the driving factors as the rent gap. Put very simply, this is the difference in the cost of the land in its current state compared with its potential profitability if it was turned to other uses. The current cost or value is based on features of the neighbourhood like housing standards, crime rates, green spaces and infrastructure provision. As lower income neighbourhoods or old industrial districts usually perform poorly on the basis of these criteria, the cost of land in these areas, best represented by property prices, is significantly lower than might be expected or than it could be, given that these neighbourhoods are usually very centrally located in the city. Because of this gap, the very first gentrifiers, often young professionals and sometimes underground artists, they see a good opportunity to improve their living standards by benefiting from lower rent in a good location. Their movement to the neighbourhood usually paves the way for higher income groups who come later. Very little displacement occurs during the first stage, as these pioneer gentrifiers usually move into vacant housing or housing that has come to the market as part of the normal housing turnover. While this explanation primarily focuses on the economics of land supply and demand, other interpretations stress the importance of social and cultural aspects. This is often referred to as the socio-cultural milieu, the context or environment in which people choose to live, and this is often very important in gentrifiers' locational choices. Often, these social groups look for neighbourhoods with specific characteristics, namely diversity, vibrancy, and vitality. Examples from across the globe would suggest that it is generally a combination of the economic and socio-cultural that we have described above that results in a neighbourhood's gentrification. Not by chance, the most well-known examples of gentrified districts, such as Brooklyn, Williamsburg before, Bedford-Stuyvesant later, Shoreditch in London, the Castro in San Francisco, and Kreuzberg in Berlin, all present a common set of characteristics that fit with our earlier explanation. They all had lower than average quality housing, proximity to the city centre, and/or a particularly unique urban character, a concentration of minority groups, and a lively street culture of cafes or open-air markets. When this combination of characteristics starts attracting higher income residents to an area, a process of neighbourhood upscaling takes place. This initially involves the refurbishment of residential buildings, as well as the functional redesign of industrial structures for housing or commercial purposes. At this stage, gentrification might be understood as a positive force, enhancing a neighbourhood's social mix and livability. But it is what happens next that makes it more troublesome and a key issue in terms of the housing crisis. Once the pioneer gentrifiers move in and become active in upgrading the built environment, usually an increase in land and rent prices ensues. Once this happens, the process of displacement, where current residents are forced to move because they cannot afford to live anymore, begins to take hold. In 2006, research from Harvard University suggested that 10,000 households were displaced by gentrification each year in New York City. Follow-up interviews found that among those displaced, many ended up living in overcrowded apartments, shelters, or even became homeless. The first ones to leave are usually retailers, who can no longer afford the rent of their commercial spaces, and they are often replaced by organic markets, gluten-free bakeries, and fair trade coffee shops. These are closely followed up by residents, who not only are crushed under rent increases, but also struggle to meet their daily needs as local services are often targeted at the newer residents with higher disposable incomes. More recently, gentrification that was initially born out of the spontaneous migration of artists and the like to the inner city has become a conscious strategy in local government's approach to urban regeneration and post-industrial restructuring. In these cases, a redevelopment plan provides the context within which former industrial working-class districts are demolished and regenerated as high-income districts, usually including a mix of housing, office, and high-end retail space. In North America, Europe, and Australia, this has particularly occurred through waterfront regeneration, as former port areas and riversides are redeveloped for new service or high-end residential uses. In an earlier learning step, we examined government responses to the housing crisis in Nanjing, China, and how the displacement of residents there to large public housing complexes on the edge of cities has opened up the historic inner city district for redevelopment, with very attractive but expensive villas and luxury retailing. Gentrification is therefore an important global urban issue. Whether it should be supported or constrained is an issue of topical debate. Some people argue that governments could introduce a rent cap to prevent displacement because of high rents, while others argue that if gentrification didn't occur, large parts of the city would remain vacant and derelict. So what do you think? Is gentrification happening in your city? And if so, with what impacts?